So, Jim, you are a current chair of a board, and I'd love to have a chance to have your reflections on the current state of board engagement with respect to gender diversity.
Okay, so to start with, I asked myself the question, what is the current state of board engagement with respect to gender diversity? And as I said before, if half of Canadian public companies can't find one woman director, notwithstanding the fact that our new Prime Minister so aptly pointed out that it is 2015, then it certainly looks as if boards are not particularly engaged in this topic, which is pretty discouraging. But I do get the sense that there is more engagement at the board level than what those statistics do suggest. And perhaps it's just this activity is going on under the radar, or perhaps it's just my own wishful thinking. When you look at the role of a board, what is the objective of a corporate board? It's to have a high-performing board acting in the best interests of stakeholders and the organization, to add value through effective oversight and insight. And to achieve that, boards require genuine and robust processes for board recruitment, succession, onboarding, evaluation, renewal, and succession. And since there's been very strong evidence for some time to suggest that gender diversity is in itself value add, I cannot help but conclude that at least 50% of Canadian public companies do not have robust processes at their board. And since it's an issue, as I said, of enhancing performance, then when you have an obvious failure like this on the part of boards, it's understandable that shareholders' demands increase and regulators start imposing various rules, quotas, and mandatory reporting. Over the years, there's been a lot of lip service paid to the desire to have gender diversity at the board, but not a lot of progress, as we talked about. Since we're all products of our experiences, I thought I'd share some of mine with you as a stereotypical baby boomer. I still remember in the 1980s a bank chief executive officer claiming that the bank had been looking for over a year but had been unable to identify one qualified woman in Canada to sit on his board. But by the early 1980s, the issue was starting to gain some attention, if not just backlash from women shareholders. I recall sitting on a board in the United States that had cumulative voting. I could never figure out why our lawyer, Lori Weisberg, always got more votes than I did. Then realized that many shareholders supported him because they thought he was a woman. I'm also embarrassed to say that the first time I sat on a board that had either a senior woman in the executive suite or a woman director was in 1987. I left that business in 1992, and the next time I encountered women in the executive suite or on a board was when I joined Teachers in 2001. But even then, that industry was not terribly female-friendly. When I joined Teachers to head the private investing group, there was a dinner hosted by one of the professional firms to welcome me to the industry. The guest list comprised 50 practitioners and senior supporting professionals in the industry. There was only one woman. Now, incidentally, my successor as head of private investing at Teachers is female, but even today, she is an anomaly in the industry worldwide. During the last 10 years of my career at Teachers, we made considerable progress. 4 of our 9 board members were women, including the chair. My executive team comprised 5 women and 3 men. And although my successor as CEO is male, there were serious contenders in the finalist list who were women. So perhaps next time. Today, my governance world is pretty gender blind. At Queen's, the chair of the board is a woman. At the Hospital Foundation, the chief executive officer and the entire senior staff are female. At the MasterCard Foundation, which is the 4th largest foundation in the world, the CEO and 3 of 5 senior staff are women. And my predecessor as chair was also a woman. Yes, you might say these are all not-for-profit organizations, but by any measure, they are very large businesses. All over $100 million enterprises with complex missions, many employees, and in the case of MasterCard, operating on a worldwide basis with over 14 billion in assets. Interestingly, when I was approaching retirement a couple of years ago, I thought for a moment about joining some corporate boards. I eventually decided to go in a different direction, but in the meantime, I had met with 3 recruiters to discuss board opportunities. Within 5 minutes, they would change the conversation and ask what my wife's plans were. It was clear to me that today, her currency, a woman with financial expertise, was far stronger than mine. So that's the progression of my experiences, fairly typical for a baby boomer, the group who called the shots during the past several decades. So yes, I think gender diversity has worked itself into the agendas of boards and governance committees, some of them kicking and screaming. And I am told that a majority of board searches today are for women or other diversity candidates. But simply meeting a gender diversity target is not sufficient to improve governance. This is not about box ticking. It will only add value if accompanied by genuine and robust processes for board recruitment, selection, onboarding, evaluation, renewal, and succession. Now, I have heard that one solution is board term limits. Personally, I think that term limits are really a cop-out, a crutch to avoid having a board evaluation process and not an answer to the diversity challenge. Let me spend a minute on diversity within the executive suite. I told you my story from teachers, a high-performing executive team comprising 5 females and 3 males. The board had little to do with driving that outcome except to support me in building the best team possible. That team was not built through affirmative action. Rather, we were looking for the best candidates. Some were internally developed, and some were recruited from outside. Interestingly, 3 of the team members, all of whom were women, were acknowledged to be world leaders in their field and still are today. The rest of us were just good. So my advice to a human resources committee, it starts with transparency into the HR and talent management practices so that you have an appreciation of how well the company is developing its talent in general, where the gaps are and where the vulnerabilities are. It isn't just looking at the statistics and throwing up your hands and saying, well, that's the industry. Understand subtle or not so subtle unconscious biases or barriers that may lead the company to exclude 50% of the potential talent pool from its executive ranks. Understand the culture. Is it female hostile? And are there things that can be changed in the environment to open up the possibility of attracting women? Things like remote working or flex days, etc. The committee should also understand the development plans in place for fast-tracking talent. How about coaching and mentoring programs? And if you want greater diversity, the company has to ensure that the talent is ready when the opportunity arises. As a side note, one great development technique is to encourage up-and-coming women executives to join an outside corporate board. It kind of kills 2 birds with 1 stone for this debate. Rather than thinking of an outside board as a distraction, think of it as an opportunity to broaden experience and scope. Some affirmative action ideas that I've seen work well. One is to ensure at least 1 woman in the 3 finalist positions for any hire or promotion. Secondly, ensure at least 1 woman in succession swim lanes with a realistic development plan to get them there in time. And third, ensure that there is a sufficient intake of women at the lower levels so that you can build a strong supply in the pipeline. In my view, we are making progress at an increasing pace, although it's hard to see it in the stats. But it's still not fast enough, and we still have a long way to go. I'd like to think that by 2020, this will no longer be a topic of discussion in the corporate governance world. And why do I believe that's possible? First of all, it's going to be aided by technology. Technology will help solve many environmental issues that have been barriers to women. And secondly, technology is gender blind and allows the best talent to leapfrog forward without the historical baggage of being either a woman or a man. And then secondly, the intergenerational transfer of power. And by that time, 2020, the transfer of power from baby boomers who have dragged their feet on this issue to the millennials that we have seen in the recent election win will accelerate the process. We baby boomers will still be around in the form of gray power, but we will be less concerned about the gender of the productive sectors of our economy as long as they keep us in the style to which we're accustomed.